engagement is an exchange, a conversation, a collaboration between journalists and the public. Journalism today is not something that's done in isolation. A really great report by the Tao Center at the School of Journalism at Columbia really explains how journalism is no longer a linear process between news organizations and the audience, or a passive audience. On the contrary, the journalist today has a vast network of people, of sources, followers, and others to help in the process of reporting and distributing work. Audience engagement also helps in the creation of communities around various topics and news events, bringing people together who have a common interest, who have common questions, and who want answers. Finally, I think that audience engagement lends a transparency to what we do, which ultimately, I believe, helps us to do this job much more efficiently, much more openly, and with a much greater reach. That's a very good question. It does sound like marketing when you use phrases like branding and audience engagement. These are terms that are used in marketing, but I think in the context of journalism, it's quite different. Because there's so much more that can be gained than to promote or to sell a product. In journalism, the participation of the audience essentially helps to do many more things. It can create a conversation among people. It can result in changes in policies and in the response of government, for example, into issues that people care very much about. And those are the sorts of things that all of us become journalists to do, to change the world. A colleague of mine, David Kellogg, who has taught the class Audience Engagement at Columbia when we offered it as an individual class, had a wonderful construct in which to think about audience engagement. He put it into 3 pieces, the first of which is news gathering. Today there are so many different ways in which we can gather news, find sources, and cultivate a community that helps us find the topics that we pursue as journalists. The second piece of audience engagement, according to David Kellogg, is content framing. And this has to do with how we present these stories. And that applies to everything from the headline, the photographs that you use, the use of infographics, and even the time of day or week that we choose to distribute this work, all factor into the framing, the content framing part of the engagement with our audience. The third component of audience engagement has to do with promotion and distribution. And I think today, more than ever, using social media gives us the opportunity as journalists to ask the very fundamental question, who do we want to read the story? And this is a very profound question, because with social media, we can now look for those communities online, on Twitter, on Facebook, individuals, organizations, institutions that have an interest in many of the subjects that we write about, and target those audiences more directly. In fact, this is a communication that doesn't have to be one-sided. The interaction and conversation that results from reaching out to these people and institutions through the distribution of our stories is the kind of conversation that continues long after that story is finished. Audience and engagement is a process that can be implemented as an individual journalist or as an institution, as a news organization through various accounts, social media accounts. But at the very beginning, I think it's important to consider what are your objectives as a journalist, as a storyteller. Is it to gain as many clicks as you can, followers, users, likes? Or is it a sense of who is looking at your story? Where do you want it to go, and what sort of changes and reactions, are you hoping to spark with your story? I think it requires a certain comfort level with the medium, with the openness to communicate with the public, and maybe to open yourself up to criticism or even personal attacks. And of course, you also have to be willing to spend an extraordinary amount of time verifying and researching the content that is created through audience engagement. Audience and engagement can be measured in a variety of ways, and I can think of two. The first is through analytics, so the measurement of likes, shares, retweets, the number of followers. Those are all pretty basic, and there's a variety of ways to measure that. But the other way to measure audience and engagement, to me, is much more qualitative, much more profound in many ways. And that has to do with the response to your storytelling or investigation, the response by government officials and organizations and the public in general to address an issue that they all have in common, really. And the reaction itself can help extend the life of that story, because it will often start a conversation that continues long after you've finished your story. A great example of audience engagement was done by The Guardian, which has been a real leader in the use of crowdsourcing. And in this particular instance, The Guardian sought out to count the number of people in the United States who had been killed by police officers. And surprisingly, that number had never been counted. The government doesn't keep statistics about police deaths or the deaths of people by police. And in doing the reporting, they reached out to lots of different communities to help them piece together these cases. And that included victims' families, lawyers, any number of people who might be connected in some way to these deaths. And the result was a huge database that has all kinds of data by race and location, geography, that can be used by any number of people, other journalistic organizations, government officials, families, advocates, lawyers, and they also created this community through Facebook and I believe Twitter to help people who had questions, who had stories to tell, who wanted to be part of the conversation. And I was showing the students today that on the Facebook page for this project, which is called The Count, there was a message by The Guardian that said it would not be continuing to count the number of deaths in the US by police because the federal government had made a commitment to doing it themselves. And this was a huge response to the project, which I think was a great model for investigations of this type, especially now when the issue of the relationship between police and communities of color is so very much in the news, so very much on the minds of Americans. Another great example of audience and engagement and the use of a tool called crowdsourcing was done by ProPublica's Patient Harm Project. In this project, the news organization asked the public to submit via a form on their website stories of experiences of harm in medical facilities or hospitals. And you know, I found it extraordinary that people responded, that they were willing to talk about these very personal, painful experiences in detail to this organization. And I think it's largely due to the reputation of ProPublica as a real leader in investigative storytelling. ProPublica also created a Facebook group in which people could share their stories, ask questions, and just have a sense of community. And that grew to about 4,000 members, and I believe it's still active today. And I thought it was a great example to show students about how projects like these can live on so much longer than just one day or one publication day, but actually grow into something much bigger, much more profound, and to have an impact that is very hard to measure, but very much game-changing.